Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to today's Ask the Expert webinar on asset management and how to begin. My name is Tess Clark. I work here at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Registered attendees can receive a certificate of attendance for participating in this webinar today. We have not submitted this webinar to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits. So you will need to self-submit in order to receive any available credit, and make sure that this webinar meets the criteria and standards of the licensing agency in your state or territory. Certificates will be emailed within 30 days of this webinar to the email address you used to register. This session is one of several webinars conducted by the Environmental Finance Center Network for the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project. The EFCM provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all 50 states and 5 territories to help local systems achieve and maintain compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. Okay, and here you can sort of take a look at our small systems team. We do have a network that extends across the US. We have centers in most US regions, as you can sort of see here. And here you can see the areas of expertise that we focus on. So we do workshops, trainings, direct technical assistance on all the following topics: water loss reduction, asset management, like we're going to be talking about today, managing drought, and many, many others. We also have a small systems blog. You can learn more about water finance through this blog. Our blog posts also feature lessons learned from our trainings, descriptions of available tools, and also some small system success stories. If you so choose, you'll have the opportunity to subscribe to this blog at the end of the webinar. And one last EFCN resource I'd love to point out to you before we get going is our online funding sources map. This tool can help you find the major sources of funding for drinking water infrastructure for each state and territory. Quickly, here's how you can access those tables. On the EFCN homepage, go to the Resources tab and then click Funding Sources by State. This is going to take you to a map of the country. If you click on the state that you're interested in, you'll find a PDF table of the relevant sources of drinking water infrastructure funding. The table looks like the image on the left of the slide. For each funding program, it includes the name, a short description, and also the contact information for someone who works at that program that you can reach out to. Before I turn the presentation over to our experts for today, I have 2 quick polling questions. These are just going to get the ball rolling and help us sort of see what kind of folks are joining us today. So first, what kind of water or sewer utility do you represent? Just select the best option there for you. We've got about 30% of people responding so far, so I'm going to give you 3 more seconds to go. All right. It looks like we've got about 46% of folks aren't from a drinking water system today, but we have a strong showing of local government and municipal systems as well, 27%. All right, and secondly, what size water or sewer system does your utility operate? And then this is just by the number of people served. So do your best to tell us whether you're a very small system, small, medium, large, or very large. And wow, so most people have voted, so I'm going to close this in about 3, 2, and 1. And great, so of our folks that are water systems today, the majority are small, 501 to 3,300 people served. So a lot of this asset management, this question and answer session could be very useful to you. All right, great. So that concludes the introduction part of this webinar. I'm going to turn our presentation over to our experts, Heather Himmelberger and Ross War. They're going to be answering your questions today.
Thank you, and welcome everybody out there listening in to the webinar today. Just a real quick introduction for each of us. Again, my name is Heather Himmelberger. I'm the director of the Southwest Environmental Finance Center here at the University of New Mexico, and we're coming to you today from Albuquerque. I've been doing asset management for over 15 years and kind of have worked all over the country with all different kinds of systems, doing training and implementation assistance in asset management, and it's something that I feel very passionate about and really like to have the opportunity to help water and wastewater utilities with thinking about asset management, planning for it, implementing it, and that sort of thing. And many years ago, Ross and I met at an asset management conference and really hit it off and loved to geek out and talk about asset management. And I've convinced him that Albuquerque is at the crossroads of America. So when he comes over, he stops by, and we have these opportunities to get together and do these webinars to answer questions about asset management. So we're really pleased to have Ross with us today, and I'm so happy to be able to share his expertise with you all out there, because he's an amazing resource for asset management information. So Ross, why don't you talk a little bit about your background?
So, and just the cough there, somebody on the long haul flight sat next to me that had a cold or a flu, and that's what you really love on long haul flights. So they've been very sharing. So I apologise for any coughs or splutters, but my background was municipal engineering. Opportunity came up to start consulting in New Zealand in this September 20 years ago. So I've been doing asset management planning and strategic planning, asset management information system consulting in New Zealand, Australia, up into the Pacific Islands. Last year I was doing some work for the World Bank in Sierra Leone, so just remotely. So across the world, and again, like Heather, a real passion for the subject and just helping communities manage their assets better with a more of a longer term focus to provide the services in a sustainable way. And that, as Heather says, we met at a conference some years ago, and we've managed to catch up just about every year since, one way or another. That's included Heather coming out to New Zealand a few times. I try to get to the US every year to a conference. So we've kept this association, this collaboration going, and we do these webinars as part of it. It's been a lot of fun. So
great. So this webinar won't have a lot of video presentation over the, so it's mostly audio with us just answering questions and that sort of thing. But at some point we will show a few things from the web. We did ask people to go ahead and submit some questions beforehand so that we could kind of get ready with what types of questions were on people's minds. So we have quite a few of those. We're going to start with the questions that were submitted ahead of time. And then feel free to submit questions as you go along. If you would like to ask a question to clarify something we're saying, or you have a question about that topic, go ahead and submit that in the chat box and we will address those. If you have a question about something completely different, and either you didn't have a chance to ask the question ahead or it came up, while you're listening to us, again, go ahead and put that in the chat box and we'll address those as we go along. These
are really good questions that came in early too, Heather. I mean, it's just been so helpful in preparing for this webinar to have some really, really good questions. It's sparked us already in terms of the discussion.
Great. So where we're going to start is actually at the very basic question. We got quite a few questions coming in along the lines of where do we start? How do we begin? How do you set up an asset management program? What's the best way to start if you're a small system? So a lot of questions along those lines of just where, a really good starting place is. So Ross, I'll throw that question out to you. Somebody wants to start an asset management plan. What do you tell them?
Well, and I'm of the age that I grew up with Sound of Music, so I always take Julie Andrews' advice, which is start at the very beginning. And I think as Heather and I were discussing this prior to the webinar starting, one of the things that's really good to do is what's an area where you've got a problem that needs solving, and that might be a pump, or it might be some valves, or it might be a bore or a well, could be a tank, and start where you've got some urgent need or some problem, and do some inventory there and some condition assessment and maybe some work history, gather that up and do a little study on that, and that will get you going. It'll help you get the systems and processes in place to start your asset management, but it also reporting back to your management or to your board or your municipality. They go, hey, oh, that was really good. That solved that problem. We've now got a path forward. And I think you had a really good example of that, Heather.
Yeah, I mean, we've worked with a lot of utilities where they're very small, and we try to encourage them to think of something that would really help you. So what would make your life a little bit better? What would make you sleep a little bit better at night? And so just a couple of examples. One utility had a bunch of valves, and it turns out some of their valves turned to the right and some of their valves turned to the left. And you can imagine the problems that might occur if you go out to operate a valve and you're not sure whether it's a right valve or a left valve, and you don't know which way to turn it. So you're going to break a lot of valves that way and cause yourself a lot of trouble. So think of the extra work you create by either breaking a valve or trying to spend a lot of time figuring out which way they turn. So for them, a really good starting place was, let's go out and figure out which valves turn which direction. You know, where are the valves, how many turns it takes, what direction do they go? And then they painted the inside of the valve can lid a certain color. So if it was turning to the right, it was one color. If it turned to the left, it was another color. So you can imagine how much time and effort you're going to save by having that information now available to you. So they had an inventory, they had a map, and then they have this painted valve cans. So now the time that they save by not having to fix a lot of valves, by not having to spend a lot of time figuring out which way they turn, that can be used for something else. So maybe the next thing is, I want to know where my meters are. I want to know where my pipe is. So you can start small and keep building from there. You don't have to do everything at once if you don't want to. Other people start with like a meter inventory and think about, you know, do I know where all my meters are? So that kind of gets you into a revenue issue. Like, is every customer actually having a meter and paying? And you might think the answer is yes, but it's not always.
The interesting thing there too is perhaps where not to start is trying to build a massive inventory at highly detailed level before you do anything else, because you might never get there. And most senior managers or boards, if they see no results for 3 or 4 or 5 years, are going to can the program, maybe even sooner than that. So I think this idea of starting in a place to solve a particular issue is a really good idea. I was saying to Heather earlier, I can remember from your last election campaign, there was an ad running, you know, who do you want to answer the phone at 3 o'clock? And from an asset management point of view, it's a different question. Is if the phone goes off at 3 a.m. in the morning, which asset would you hate it to be? Somebody ringing up and saying, hey, this asset has failed, or is it the pipe under the interstate? Is it the tank up on the hill? Is it that really old pump in the bore field that you should have replaced 10 years ago? And so if you can think your way through and say, hey, well, if I had a 3 a.m. phone call, what asset would be the worst one for me to ever have to deal with? That can be a good starting place, because what you've just done and said, that's my highest risk. That's going to be an awful mess. And then you can go, well, okay, now I've thought about that. I can go and find some information and do some inventory on that asset group, or do some condition inspections, talk to my operators or my supervisors, sort out a management plan for that asset or group of assets. Now I've dealt with the problem.
And you can always remember that you don't have to do everything at once. Just like Ross said, like, we don't need 5,000 bits of information about every asset to begin the program. You can always add to it over time, and you can always improve the accuracy and things like that. So you don't have to get really caught up in having the perfect asset management program or the perfect inventory. It's really just about doing things that will help you make better decisions and help you, save you time and energy and resources in one area that you can use in another. So a lot of times when we go out to utility, there's a lot of inefficiencies in what they're doing. So as you change your practices to help you be more efficient, you gain time that will make your life a little bit easier, a little bit better. But then you can do the next thing. So you can start small and build it over time, and you can start simple and make it more complex as you go. Some systems will never need to be very complex. If you're a very small utility, keeping it relatively simple can be just fine. If you're a very large utility, over time you'll be a little bit more complex, but you don't have to go crazy with this stuff. And another place to think about starting is if you don't have any mapping at all, that's kind of a logical place to start, is to build a simple map for yourself. And there's a lot of tools out there nowadays that, many things you can put on a tablet or a phone, and you can go out and you can get all kinds of data. And so it's a really simple way to you know, build a map for yourself that will help you know where your assets are. So thinking about, you know, just logical, simple starting places. And somebody asked about a small system. So that's often a starting place for a small system, is if you don't start with answering a question of, you know, or like we mentioned, where you might need information about valves or meters or hydrants or something like that, then start with a map. You know, it's a nice, simple, logical starting place that you can build off of and do a lot more with.
And if you can, while you're mapping, you know, how old is that asset? You know, is it 100 years old? Is it 50 years old? 20 years old? And just your best guess at that with a map is you can do an awful lot of planning off just that bit of information. And the thing again not to do is to try and get that down to sub-millimeter accuracy. Some people might be tempted to do that, but it's just, as Heather said, basic map is a very good idea.
So we're going to move on to a different topic. We got a really interesting question here. And it's basically a staffing question. Who does your asset management? Is there someone that is specifically assigned to it that doesn't do anything else? So this is a question kind of asking, like, do you have to have an asset manager and then you turn over all of your asset management program to that person, or is everybody involved? And so I think that's a really interesting question about staffing. So Ross, why don't you take it away talking about staffing?
Yeah, and I think the observation over the last 20 years in New Zealand is, particularly with the smaller systems, is there's somebody who has a title of engineer, and might be operations engineer or city engineer or whatever it is, and maybe they have quite a small staff and they're doing a lot of day-to-day stuff because that's what they're resourced to do. And they find out about asset management. They go, this is a good thing. We want to do this. In New Zealand, we're mandated to do asset plans on a 3-year cycle. That's because that's our political cycle. And so there's a requirement to have a plan updated every 3 years. And I've had a very successful business for the last 20 years, helping people that haven't quite got there. Because best intentions in the world, operations trumps planning. You're not going to have the phone call that says the pipe's broken or the pump's broken and go, look, no, I can't deal with that for 2 or 3 weeks because I'm doing this plan. That's just not how the world works. So it is really, really good to have the people who are operationally involved in asset management. It's actually vital to have those people involved, but often they don't have the time to sit down and write the plans. And so I think that's where having a specialist resource, if you can, if you're big enough to have one resource, that's good, but you want to make sure they don't get isolated and in a little silo, or you get some external resource, which is what we do with our smaller utility consultants. They get us in for a few weeks or a month every couple of years to help them. And but probably what I would advise against is getting somebody else to write the thing entirely with no input, because that just sits on a shelf. That's just a compliance document. It's the thinking process that's really important. I think, Heather, your team have been involved for a long time now, helping people just work their way through the ins and outs of asset management and do the thinking. That's where the real gains are.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the main thing with the staffing is you have to have everybody involved or asset management can't work, because essentially everybody does asset management. So if you ask whose job is it to do asset management, the answer is everybody. Whether you have one person or 500 people or 5,000 people, everybody has a role in asset management. You might be doing data collection, you might be doing operations, you might be doing maintenance, but everybody is touching the asset management program. So what you really want to avoid is having one person or 2 people sitting in a room somewhere and, well, those are my asset managers and the rest of us can ignore it because they're taking care of it. No, it doesn't work that way. So on the one hand,
well, it doesn't work well that way.
Exactly, it doesn't work well that way. So on the one hand, you don't want this 1 or 2 people sitting somewhere doing asset management, ignoring everybody else. So everybody needs to be involved. You also don't want to make it so that nobody's really in charge of it, because that doesn't work so well either. So you kind of want somebody's responsibility as the overall planning or the overall sustainability of the program, making sure you keep it running, but everybody has a role and everybody knows that they fit in and that they can be a part of the program.
And look, just a wee example of one of my clients, which they're a medium to larger sized authority in New Zealand, and they had a role for a single asset manager across the whole organisation. Their job was to do the policy development and to do the templates and the update templates for each year, fitting in with the corporate policy requirements and things like that, and to be an internal resource for the line operations and management teams. I got involved because they wanted me to coach the line team people, and it worked really. That worked well because there was a corporate information coming out for the whole organisation that people go, right, I've got to fill this thing out and get it done. But the organisation also realised that there was a need for training and coaching and mentoring for staff that perhaps hadn't had very much exposure to that process. And but the whole idea was to get the internal ownership going right across the teams, and it takes time, but it's been relatively successful.
Great. Let's move on to asset inventory questions. So one of the components, the core components of asset management is sort of the current state of the assets, which gets into your asset inventory. You know, what do you own? Where is it? What is it worth? You know, what's it going to cost you to replace it? Condition, useful life, all of those sorts of things go into your inventory. So we had a lot of people ask some questions about different aspects of the inventory, and a very interesting couple of questions sort of focused around what you put in your inventory. So somebody asking, you know, should I catalog every piece of hardware? And somebody else kind of asking the question slightly differently to say, you know, maybe we have too many assets in our inventory. How do we determine, you know, when it's time to maybe remove some of those assets because there's more in the inventory than maybe there should be? So that's a good starting place to just talk about what actually belongs in your inventory.
Well, they're really good questions, and I think they're a question everybody building an inventory has to answer at some stage. And the answer to the question for any particular authority is to back out of the question a little bit and say, what do we need? What information do we need to manage? And if you think about where our industry is going with, you know, micro sensors and Internet of Things and all of that, so those trends, we're going to get buried in a tsunami of very fine data. So the data collection is getting quicker and easier, but that still doesn't help you with the question of what do I need? What questions do I need to answer to manage this network or this system or the delivery of service well? And that once you start thinking that, okay, what do I need to answer any regulatory or management or board or risk or permit related questions or other things that the organization's committed to, then you can go, right, what level of information and detail, and the question around cataloging every piece of hardware. I mean, we over the years in New Zealand have also had this debate. And you go, well, I've got a flange. Do I collect information on every single bolt on that flange? Well, hopefully the answer is no, but maybe that's the most critical flange in your system with a long history of trouble. Maybe somebody feels that they need to. So it's important to have that sort of discussion. And there's two components that discuss, well, three components. One is, do I need this information to manage? Do I need this information because of a particular risk? Is the second thing, and then and that risk might just be how critical this component is to the whole system. And then can I manage, once I've put information into an inventory, can I manage, update, and am I resourced to do that? And that's where it gets, if you collect one level of too much of information, you will die because you can't update and resource it. The resource, the updating, the condition, the maintenance history against it. What I would say to people is start high, start at a high level of information, and then if you need more detailed information, work your way down to that. Where it gets a bit tricky is treatment plants, because sometimes you have really critical components. and you want the detail. So there's not a standard, this is what you should do answer. It's more, what are your risks? What do you need to manage? And can I maintain the information in a way that maintains confidence in it? Because you give a board or a senior management group information and they go, that's wrong. At that point, the whole program's in doubt because they know it's wrong. And that can often happen when you get into too much detail.
And you have to think about what it's going to take to keep it up, because you have to update your inventory over time. And if you have every little nut and bolt in your system, it's going to be so time consuming to keep it up that you just won't. You'll just give it up. So it's almost like if you don't have any data, that's really bad. If you have too much data, that's really bad too. So keeping it more manageable is better than having this overly detailed inventory. And one of the questions we ask people is, how would you manage that asset? If it's something that you don't really do anymore, then it works until it doesn't, and then we throw it away and put a new one in. Do you really need to have that in asset inventory? Because you're not handling it as a maintenance item. You're not handling it as a decision-making item. It's inexpensive, or it's not worth doing maintenance on it. So as you start thinking about how you handle your assets, it can help you decide what to put in and what not to. But we're very much in line with Ross's thinking that putting in less at the beginning is better than more, because most utilities that we end up working with after they've already started a plan is you look at their inventory and it's way more detailed than they want, and they've quit using it because it just got overwhelming, and you end up having to do what this questionnaire says, you know, take some things out. And it's like, okay,
hard.
Let's give up the data that we put in there. And then it becomes, I think it is a hard thing to do. Like, wow, I spent this time putting this in here and now you're going to take it out. But it's sometimes the best thing to do is to take that out.
Yeah, and I mean, a good example of that sort of thing is pumps. So if you've got a small pump set and you replace that pump set as a unit, if it fails, the motor, the impellers, everything just comes out and you drop a new one in, then you really only need one bit of inventory that says we've got this type of pump with this sort of impeller and it's X amount of years old and it's in this condition. If you've got, let's say, $100,000 pump with a large motor and a shaft and a separate impeller system and maybe a reasonably complicated variable speed drive, and you're going to replace those components separately over time, you might replace the impeller 3 times before you replace the motor or whatever it is, then you would hold them as separate inventory items. So you'd say, yeah, we've got the motor, we've got the shaft, we've got the impeller, we've got the VSD. And that makes perfect sense. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to be holding, I don't think you need to hold that sort of information on a $2,000 pump set. You know, it's when it breaks, you're going to put another one in. That's the end of the story. The really big pump sets, yes, you break them up a little bit more. So that's sort of rule of thumb. And the same sort of thing with pipes. You know, how do you replace pipes in your particular authority? Do you do it block to block? Do you do it if it's a certain length? And that might start providing some guidance as to how you record the pipes, the reticulation. So it's often how do you replace will give you a really good indication as to what level of detail of inventory you need to go down to.
And then we had some questions of basically, you know, how do you get started creating an asset inventory, asset registry, you know, the best way to organize that registry. So that gets into, you know, where are you going to put the data, how are you going to collect it? And as I mentioned before with the mapping comment earlier, is there are a lot of apps that you can put on tablets and phones that really help you collect information that can be customized to meet your needs, so that you can literally stand in front of a piece of equipment, answer some questions about it, you know, who's the manufacturer, what's the horsepower, take a photo, take video if you want, record audio if you want, get a location, you know, from satellites. It's super easy to do a lot of that now with apps, and you can start real simple with either, you know, an Excel spreadsheet or access database, if you know how to program databases, but just a simple spreadsheet will get you a lot of the way, and that can be exported to something else later, but that's a good starting place, is just to get you started with a spreadsheet of, what's the key information I want, and, what will help me manage the asset in the future. If I know certain things, will that help me manage the asset later? If it won't help me manage it later, then I probably don't need that bit of information.
And look, I mean, 10 years ago, pre-iPhone, we would do those on a lot of that on pieces of paper. If you're a really small utility, you might, you got 15 miles of pipe or something less than that. Maybe you're still going to do that on a piece of paper, but generally I would say to people now, try and do that on a tablet or a phone, so that you're cutting out the double handling on the paper. There's really not a lot of need to do that. Here's, I think, we've been going for a while now. Have we got any questions that have come out of that session, out of our answers?
Yes, absolutely. There are lots of questions coming in. So in regards to what you're talking about right now, there was a question about should assets be managed using a spreadsheet or a database? And Heather touched on that briefly about, you can start with either one depending on what you have capabilities of managing in-house. But similar questions are arising from this conversation about the apps that you're referring to, and can you name some of them, and can you recommend a free software, those types of questions. So I just wanted to let people know that you guys are definitely going to address that. So for them to just hang in there for a few more minutes. And then I think that if you want to talk a little bit more about the capturing of the data with the spreadsheets, that would cover several questions.
Yeah, so we got a lot of pre-questions around software, and we thought we'd deal with or talk about some of the bigger picture stuff, the setup, the conceptual stuff at the start. We've had a lot of questions in the pre-questions as well around tools to use and things like that. We had 13 questions on software, so we are going to deal with that probably in the last third of the webinar in a little bit of detail. And
I think what I will mention here is it was a strategic decision to do that, and I'll share with you what our strategic thinking was so that you'll understand why it came towards the end instead of the beginning. And the problem is people are starting to equate software with asset management, and software does not equal asset management. It won't do the thinking for you. As much as we would like to just plug a bunch of data into a program, push a button, and out spits all the answers of what we need to do, it doesn't really work that way. Asset management is so much more about the thinking and about the people, and so much less about the physical piece of software you choose to use. So we wanted to focus on the other aspects first before we got into software to prevent propagating the myth that it's all about the software. Software can help you for sure, but it's not asset management. It's a tool that you can use in your asset management program, but we want to separate the thought that asset management software is the be-all end-all, and it's really much more about thinking through what you're trying to do as a utility, how you're managing these assets, how you're making decisions, how you're going to do replacements. And there isn't any software in the world that can replace the people and their thinking.
Yeah, and we had one software question which we will come back to, but it was what are the best tools to use to track assets and changes, prefer most efficient for lowest cost? And I wrote my answer to that was your brain. And that was a slightly humorous answer. We will come back to perhaps a more technical answer around that, but over the last 20 years, and we're the world's worst of it in New Zealand as well, people will grab a piece of software, that's the silver bullet. They've had the Fred Astaire routine from the provider, they're thrilled about what they're buying, but it doesn't do your thinking for you. And it is a good tool. There are lots of good tools, as Heather mentioned. So we'll come back to that. We're going to spend a bit of time on that a bit later. Software is important. They're important tools, but there are other things that are equally important. We were going to move to...
I do actually have one comment on the organizing and updating of the list of your asset inventory. And one of the best times to do that is actually when you are working on an asset. So you put information in your asset inventory, and will it be 100% And the answer is absolutely not. There's no possibility that your first time through developing an asset registry that you will have 100% accurate asset registry.
Even your 10th or 11th time.
Yeah, exactly. I don't
Yeah.
think 100 years from now, you're not going to have an asset registry that's 100% accurate. And that's okay. What isn't okay is you go out to a piece of equipment and your inventory tells you this is, you know, a 4-inch PVC pipe, and I dig it up, and lo and behold, it's a 6-inch cast iron pipe.
Well, that's great that you know that now.
So now I know it. Now is the time when I update my inventory, my registry. And so I say it's always right to be wrong the first time. That's no big deal. But the second time, when you've actually figured it out, you don't want to leave the incorrect information in there, because now we now know what the right answer is for that, you know, what that is. Let's fix it. So the next guy to go out doesn't show up expecting to find a 4-inch PVC. He knows it's going to be a 6-inch cast iron. So the best time to update it is as you're working on the equipment, as you're finding out the mistakes, having a business process that says, who do you provide that information to? Is that something that I log into the registry and I fix it? Do I pull up the spreadsheet and make the change? Or is there an IT person in my organization whose job it is to do that? Must I get a supervisor approval before we make the change? You know, what is your business practice to update the registry? But do it as you're finding out incorrect information, as you're working on those assets, especially the buried assets you can't see. If you can actually see them, that's the time to update the information and make sure it's correct. I mean, I don't think you necessarily have to walk around the plant every year and redo an inventory. That would take you a lot of time that's not necessary. But as you're going throughout the entire year, if you find out something is different than what you thought, no problem. Let's have a process to fix it.
And look, I remember I've been coming here, as we said in the intro, you know, for maybe 7 or 8 years now. And one of the times I was here, that question about the software versus the spreadsheets and things like that is such a good question. Heather introduced me. They were running a training seminar, and there was a gentleman who was in his late 70s or early 80s who was a voluntary custodian of a very small town's water supply, and he'd written an asset plan of 15 pages, done a great job of it. And at the back of it, he had an appendix which had the inventory, which was 2 sheets of paper. He had maybe 10 or 15 pipes, and he had a couple of pumps and a tank, and that was about it. And the thing is, for him, he didn't even need a spreadsheet. I wouldn't have even said use a spreadsheet. I just said those 2 pieces of paper at the end of the plan, that if you replaced one of those pieces of pipe, you'd cross it out and say we replaced this in 2018. And now it's HDPE or PVC or whatever it is, and it used to be cast iron or whatever it was. So it's around still saying, what do I need to manage? If you're looking after a very small system, maybe paper is still okay, not even a spreadsheet, or a very, very simple GIS with just this pipe this is what we know about it. If you're managing a city with a population of 500,000 people, that isn't going to get you over the line. So you're going to get some software, and the software will tie in with your corporate requirements as well. So it's just scaling at the right level, knowing what you have to manage, the answers you need, and updating your inventory when you get the opportunity, particularly with buried assets. The above ground assets are a little bit easier because you can go and look at them at any stage. But if you've got buried assets, the best time to update your information and your data about them is when there's a hole there, or you're replacing something, or you've had an issue. And it's getting those processes in place, and the quality management around those processes is about how you keep you on top of your inventory requirements. But I mean, the thing that always impressed me about meeting that gentleman was he was doing that for his community for free, and he'd done this really, really good job. He wasn't an engineer, he'd had a practical background. That was fine. He was doing far better than some utilities that have 5,000 or 6,000 people. I think his town was 150 or 200 people or something like that, wasn't it? So
Very small.
Very small town. It's still, asset management still does the job at that scale up to several million, or 20 million people. So
We also had one very specific question that relates to one piece of an inventory is how do you determine the realistic lifespan of a piece of equipment? And that gets into that useful life question. So we always ask people to make an estimate of how much longer you think a piece of equipment, one of your assets is going to last. And so one way that people like to use is just thinking of age. And we want to be really careful as using age as either the only or primary indicator of how much longer a piece of equipment is going to last, because it's really not that great of an indicator in many cases. And one example is a utility that we worked with, a wastewater utility. And based on age, they had done a useful life estimate of their entire plant and came up with the idea that 75% of their plant was past useful life. So the city manager was quite concerned, thinking that if we have to replace 75% of that plant, that's going to be a major investment of resources. And they were a relatively large community, about 16,000 people. So we went with the operator to talk through some of these useful life estimates, and like, okay, you put this thing was 5 years past useful life, but you're still using it. It seems in pretty good shape. What do you think? Oh yeah, I can use this for 10 more years. It's no problem. So you find out that when you actually talk about each individual piece of equipment and do a different assessment that is not age-based, but more condition-based, maintenance record-based. So have I been doing the maintenance? Do I have spare parts available? How has it been operating for me? Is it something that breaks down every week, or it hasn't broken down for the last 2 years? And putting the operator's perspective on it, we came up with a very different thing where 10% of the assets were past useful life. And so basically just by bringing in other considerations into the story instead of just age, you will find out that the useful lives are quite different than just saying, well, my pump is 10 years old and pumps last 10 years, so it's 0. Well, your pump might last 20 years. It might last 5. I mean, it's very different than just an age-related question.
And a subsidiary one to that, or an adjunct to it, is in New Zealand, and I'm sure, I know here in America, you have permits for discharge and permits for take and treatment as well, water treatment. We have the same thing. Ours are on a 30-year cycle, typically. Some are 20, but most are 30 years. And you can walk around a big wastewater treatment plant that's got a discharge permit, and you can look at the civil works, the concrete and stuff, say, well, how long is that going to last? Well, it should last 50 years. And you can say the mechanical, electrical, 20 years maybe. But here's the kicker. Every time in New Zealand for the last 3 cycles that we've renewed the discharge permits, the conditions have changed. And the minute this is environmental discharge conditions. And the minute they change, you've got different process trains. So what I've been saying to many of my clients is, look, the life of your assets is actually the life of the permit. Because if you completely change the process to meet the new environmental requirements, you're going to abandon those assets. It's not that they don't work or they aren't in good condition. It's just you're not going to have that process anymore. Oh. So me putting 100-year life on the cast iron pipe in the old process train, well, fantastic. But that's actually not the life of that asset. The life of that asset is 30 years, because at the end of 30 years, we're going to put a completely different process in. So there's that functional obsolescence due to change in permit or change in I think a lot of the probes and recording assets are like that as well. That's an area that's just charging ahead at 100 miles an hour, really. And so some of those assets might have a physical life of 20 years, but a functional life of 10 or 7 or 5 years. So it's thinking about those sorts of things. What is going to cause you to change that asset out or to change that process? And that might be the life. A very simple example in pipelines is if you've got a valve and it's got a different life on it to a pipe. So you might have a pipe that's got 30 years left and you think you've got 70 years left of the valve's life, for argument's sake. When you go to swap that pipe out, you're going to put a new pipe in on parallel alignment, hopefully. The one thing's for sure, the guys aren't going to be digging out the old valves to put them on the new pipe. they're going to fit those all up in the workshop and come out on the truck and put them in. So the life of your valve is actually the functional life of your pipeline. Same with your hydrants, and if they're on the main line, hydrants. And so it's thinking about how you replace stuff actually can give you a really good steer as to what the useful life of the asset is.
Okay, well, let's move on from inventory to level of service.
Well, should we just give see if there's any questions coming?
We can check with Don before we leave the asset inventory. Any other questions, Don, that we should answer on inventory before we move to level of service?
I think you've covered all of them on inventory.
Okay, great. So we'll move on to level of service. We had a question that says, what are some useful KPIs, which are key performance indicators, that I can develop? So, and actually, in advance of answering this question, if you could give the screen control to me, that would be great, and I'll show you one example for this one.
Yeah, I will get the screen over to you, Heather.
Okay, and in the meantime, Ross, you can start talking about it while I pull something up.
And interestingly, last year I talked about a really terrible water incident we had in New Zealand, and it's turned out after we had a full government inquiry on it, and it's turned out it's probably the worst Western world public health water incident in the last 20 years, which is not a particularly good badge to collect. And it involved untreated supply taking water that ended up having Campylobacter in it, and in a town of 15,000 people, 5,000 got sick, 4 died of secondary complications. So that's the background, and there's been a full inquiry of it. That particular authority is one of my clients, and they used to have a whole heap of water service levels. They just have one now, which is provide safe water. And their community's pretty keen on that as a service level as well. And sometimes I think with KPIs we can actually complicate them far too much. So provide safe water is a really bang, everybody can get that as a KPI for the water supply. There's a whole heap of things you have to do to actually demonstrate and prove that you're providing safe water. So is my source safe? Have I got barriers to contamination in place? Have I got safe working practices in the reticulation maintenance that will make sure it's safe? Have I protected the supply from backflow? Am I meeting all of my permitted requirements and my legal requirements? And on it goes. Now, those are all technical things that we have to do, but they also they obviously have an awful lot of monitoring and checking going on at a very high level now. So they and that all demonstrates safe water as well. And it's where you pitch those KPIs and service levels. But in their case, they've said, look, we only have one now, and that's provide safe water, and we're doing a whole bunch of stuff underneath that to demonstrate that. They're still under essentially your equivalent of federal government oversight with a lot of that as well. So they've been doing a lot of work around proving that they're providing safe water, which is what their community wants and is going to pay for. And it's useful to keep your KPIs short and focused, I think. If you look at where they originally came from, they came out of business world, maybe a Fortune 500 company with $100 billion worth of annual revenue. They might have 10 KPIs to the board can see that everything's on track. Our risk, I think, in public utilities is that we end up with 600 KPIs, and that just becomes a whole heap of reporting noise that nobody can see through. And so I think it's getting that focus back. And in this particular case, so what they've done, this particular authority's done now, they have the water one, provide safe water. The wastewater one is public health and protect the environment, because that's why you have wastewater systems. Otherwise, we'd all have wastewater or sewage running down the sides of roads because we wouldn't care. And the stormwater one, the storm drains, is protect people and property. So they've got really focused on what they actually hold those networks for, and then cascade technical measures under that. But you've got some really good ones here as well.
What I want to share on the screen right now, you'll see something that's available on the Southwest EFC website. If you go to Services, Asset Management, and Resources, you can pull up this level of service guide. This one happens to be for water, but we're also working or have developed one on wastewater that will also be able to give you some, whoops, I'm just trying to get away here. Okay, that will also be able to give you some good starting places. This was broken down into some key components that you might care about in doing a level of service. So public health and safety, as Ross was mentioning, that's usually number one. I mean, you're all about protecting the public, protecting the environment if it's wastewater, the safety of your workers, your public, you know, all of that is really important and doesn't get much more fundamental than that as your main thing. So that's why that's.
And even talking about, you know, the Flint example, you know, the minute you get on the wrong side of that, and Flint's the recent example in the USA, everything else stops. You know, that is actually the thing that is at the bedrock of public water utilities. If you're not safe and people are getting sick from drinking your water at that point, everything else you think you're doing stops while you deal with that one.
So it has public health and safety, a little bit of customer service, system maintenance, response time, like how fast you're going to respond to different things, a little bit of water loss control, drought and demand management, utility management, and internal utility goals. And you'll notice that there's some grayed out areas. These are actual target levels that you can feel free to change to whatever you want them to be. So the goals are things that you could adopt, whatever goals out of this list you liked, whatever ones fit your particular situation, change the target levels for, you know, how you operate your system, and then you will have some good level of service to begin with. This is not meant like you would adopt every single one of these, because they should be relevant to your system and what's important, but you can pick ones out of here that would help you kind of get started. And the reason we developed this document is we were finding systems of all sizes, from the very small to the very, very large, you know, hundreds of thousands to millions of people having trouble just kind of thinking through what goes into level service, what kinds of things should we think about. So this can start your thinking. You can add goals, you can choose which ones make sense for you, but at least it starts your thinking process. And even taking a step maybe above the level service goals, you know, what is your mission statement? Like, what is it that you're all about? So, you know, is there a mission statement that kind of sets the overall overarching theme for your utility? And if you have one of those, then the KPIs and level service should match, you know, what you need to do to meet that mission. So if the mission is, I'm going to serve good water and nobody's going to get sick and nobody's going to die, what are the KPIs and the service levels you need to have to make sure that doesn't happen, that people are getting good, safe water? And putting these kinds of things above finance. We want to have, you know, reasonably priced utilities, but we want to put, you know, the overarching goal of public health and safety above cutting costs just for cutting costs.
And if your mission was, hopefully we're never going to see this in our industry, but if your mission was, I want to provide the cheapest water in the world, you might be giving up some other stuff to, if that's the drive or the service level. And so that's why service level guidelines and KPIs are so important, because you have that discussion. What is it we're actually about delivering? And then what is a reasonable price for that? And that's the discussion. Should go back to Dawn and see if there's been any questions.
Dawn, any questions coming in that we need to address now?
I think that we'll get to them. So I'm going to hang on to them for just a little bit longer.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the risk and criticality. We had a question that said, what are the best references available to monetize risk from a triple bottom line approach, and specifically thinking about consequences of failure? And we should remind folks what the triple bottom line is, because maybe not everybody's familiar with that. But when you're thinking about consequences, you're often thinking about financial consequences, social consequences, and environmental consequences. So when they talk about the triple bottom line, they're thinking of those three bits. Some of those are easy to think about in money terms, like the financial, how much does it cost me to make a repair, or how much did I get sued for from a customer because I damaged their property. Others are a lot harder to monetize, like what's the damage to the environment costing me? So if a fish dies because I discharge chlorinated water into a stream, you know, what is the monetary cost of that? Or if somebody got sick, you know, what is the monetary cost associated with that? So sometimes, you know, and I think this person who's asking the question is kind of getting at, how do you evaluate things that are financial and things that are not when you're thinking about these triple bottom line issues?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And just interestingly enough, in New Zealand, we have had a long-running reconciliation process going underway with the original native indigenous population, who got, like most native indigenous populations, got completely clobbered when Western Europeans turned up. And so we also have a quadruple bottom line, because we have cultural considerations as well. And we're still working, you know, it's a feel your way in the dark type of a process in terms of getting your head around some of those sorts of questions. And the other thing, quite apart from how do you put a dollar value against things, is sometimes you can't. Maybe you can put a risk value against them, but it's also the relative weighting. So if we were to go back, let's say 40 years, yeah, it was around how much did it cost, and maybe some of the social stuff. Nobody was thinking too hard about environmental impacts. Now you would go, look, we're all a lot more aware of environmental impacts. Maybe we want to give that a lot higher weighting, and that is where there's no right answer. You need to, and if you add a cultural mix, and if you're in a place where there's cultural considerations need to be undertaken as well, how much weighting does the cultural consideration override all the other ones? And that's the discussion that has to be had. And that's not a 5-minute discussion. That's a community discussion that rolls around sometimes for upwards of a decade or more. And at some space, a community or a country or a state will say, look, this is where we've landed on this for now. And then you can go, right, well, we're going to give this much weight to environmental issues. We're going to give this much weight to social or cultural, or maybe it's just the dollar. And I mean, these are actually societal questions. You know, you will know it's a very political question, and right across the world, these sorts of things are addressed at political levels as well. And I think asset management and utility management is part of that space. So it's something you have to deal with, and it's something that is settled in phases but can change. And whatever the place the community's at that point in terms of what the weighting is, that will drive your policies for that period.
Great. I think in the interest of time, since we do have a lot more questions, we'll move on to the asset management plan. So a lot of questioners ask.
You have a lot of risk questions.
Oh, okay.
So.
All right. Well, let's take a step back, and we'll go to Dawn.
So a couple of the questions kind of revolve around criticality and then other issues. So are maintenance schedules required for critical assets?
I think if you're talking about required, it's sort of required by whom. You know, if we're talking about a state agency, that would vary from, you know, state to state, whether or not there's any specific requirement by a governmental entity for you to do that. If we're thinking about it from the standpoint of how do you want to manage your utility, and are they required in terms of, you know, having a good, well-managed, well-run utility, certainly we would hope that if it's a critical item for your utility, you're thinking about how that item would be maintained and what the best approach for maintenance is. But we have to be really cautious of a topic that we touch on in most of our trainings, is the difference between managing assets and asset management. So managing assets is what you're doing to each individual asset. So I choose to lubricate a pump, or I choose to inspect that pump, or clean a pipe, or something like that. So I'm doing a management of that particular asset versus asset management, which is that bigger picture. How does that piece of pipe or that pump or that well fit in the bigger picture? So getting the criticality requires you to think of the bigger picture. So how does, is this one critical to keep the whole system running? If so, what kind of maintenance must I do to minimize downtime, to maximize the ability to serve the good water, not cause problems? So you will have to have some kind of a maintenance schedule that considers where does this pump or pipe or well or tank or whatever it is fit in the bigger picture, and how is it critical to the system.
And one of the things I do, our national continuing professional development training on asset management for engineers New Zealand, so it's like American Society of Engineers, their training. And I've got a slide in there that shows an answer to this question, which is you also have to consider where the asset is in its life. And this slide just breaks it up into thirds. Is it in the first third, the middle third, or the last third of its life? So for a lot of assets, pipes particularly, if you're doing maintenance in the first third of the life, it'll be because somebody's hit it with an excavator or it wasn't built properly to start with. It's still in the defect liability period. Other than that, why would you be maintaining it unless it's like an air valve or something else, or a scour valve? Different story. But the actual pipe itself, if it's a critical pipe, a big pipe that's coming into town from the bore field or wells or whatever, even in the middle period of its life, the middle third, you might go, well, there's probably not too much unless something's happening. Once you get this highly critical asset and it's the last third of its life, yeah, I should know what I'm doing, and maybe I should have a preventative maintenance schedule. And but so it's useful to consider what phase of the life the asset's in, and if it's critical and at the end of its life or getting into the last third of its life, yeah, see what you need to do to manage that risk.
And also thinking about that financial inefficiency component, when it starts to get more expensive to continue to maintain that piece of equipment versus a new one. And we're seeing a lot of it happening now with obsolete equipment. A manufacturer has chosen to no longer support a particular piece of equipment, like somebody had a belt press and the manufacturer said, we don't make that belt press anymore, we don't support it, there's no spare parts available anymore. So for that particular utility, when they would have a need of a repair, they were having to go to a machine shop and request a very specific component that's built exactly to these specifications, and it was costing them a lot of money. So at some point you say, well, we can't continue to maintain this piece of equipment because the cost of maintaining it is so high, and it is critical because without it we can't dewater our solids. So now we have to look at another alternative, which might be replacing it. So that again gets into the idea of how does it fit in the system, what's the financials, how does this maintenance program fit the overall what we're trying to accomplish and the goals we're trying to set.
We need to perhaps take one more on risk, because we've promised everybody we're going to get to software in the last third, and we're in the last third now. So
okay, Don.
Okay, so one last question on risk. I think this is kind of targeting really the value of doing, determining which assets are critical. The question is, aren't most critical assets mentioned and managed in operations and maintenance manuals and the emergency response plan?
Well, that's a really good question, and the answer should be yes.
It should be.
It isn't necessarily yes, but you would certainly hope so. And there can be critical assets that are not part of the emergency response plan. Everything hopefully is in your O&M plan, but it kind of depends on who did it and how they did it and why they did it. If it's not in there, one would hope you could update your O&M plan and include those critical assets and have that be part of the O&M plan. In terms of the emergency response, depending on your emergency, there can be differences in criticality. So if the emergency is a fire, a flood, a earthquake, etc., different assets may be critical in different types of emergencies. So you wouldn't necessarily have only one kind of criticality when it's related to an emergency plan. So you also have to think about that too, of what assets are most important in emergency. Like, for example, if the power goes out, the most critical asset is your backup generator.
And I'm just seeing an example, and it was in Auckland, in our largest city, maybe a decade or so ago, and they had some quite big steel pipes going on the bridges, so the flyover bridges of the interstate, and they were getting quite old, and they hadn't inspected them for a long time, and so we did this exercise, and we said, well, those are pretty critical. They hadn't actually thought about them in those terms before, so we identified basically every single pipe that was strapped to a bridge across the interstate was a critical asset. And then we said, well, what happens if they let go? Well, we close the interstate, or that part of it. Oh, well, that's not very good. No, we don't want to do that. So in that case, they, having identified that they were critical, they then put in a fairly intensive inspection program, because that sort of asset, you want to do a planned replacement, not an emergency replacement. Even if it's in, when the pipe going across the interstate flyover bridge lets go, we know what we have to do. That actually is not where you want to be. You want to go, roll. Hey, that's an old pipe. It's an old steel pipe. It's starting to get close to pinhole leaks all the time. Maybe we're going to get a rupture. It's under fairly high pressure, and it's across the interstate. Okay. So let's get a bit smarter about how we manage that risk and when we need to replace it before we close the interstate. So.
And I think thinking about asset management as being one piece of a bigger picture is always a good idea too. Like when we're talking about asset management, we're not thinking of it as completely separate and apart from everything else the utility is doing. So certainly as you're planning for emergencies, you're thinking about your asset management inventory, you're thinking about the plan, you're thinking about how you're managing those assets. So they don't have to be separate things, and the O&M plan can be part of it. The your comprehensive plans, there's all kinds of plans out there, and they all work together, and hopefully in a nice harmony, that your asset management plan is not telling you something completely different than an emergency response plan. If that's the case, maybe you have some discussions about why the differences are there, and is it reasonable to have those differences. So I think because we've had so many questions on software and we want to make sure we address those before the end of the webinar, we'll skip to those and then we'll come back to some of these other issues.
I think so.
So let's move on to software, because we had quite a few people who did ask questions about essentially along the lines of, what software should I use? Is there a good one for a small system? What's the best bang for our buck with software? What tools should we be using? Off-the-shelf programs, that kind of thing. So a lot of questions around software.
And earlier this week, I was at APWA PWX, and all the software vendors had stalls there, and there's obviously quite a number of different vendors offering their products, and very keen to sell software to utilities. The answer to those questions is actually, what do you need the software for? And one of the things I did, I've been the section author for asset management information systems for the International Manual on Asset Management for the last couple of iterations of it. And I put a little checklist in there that said, well, first of all, what are your governance and your management tasking you to do, and what are they prepared to resource and pay for? Because until you know the answers to those questions, then the software question may not be relevant. If you're not going to get any money for it, then and it's ongoing. It's not just the initial capital purchase. The second question you need to answer around software is what questions, what outputs do I need? What reports do I need? What reporting do I need to manage this asset well? The third, once you've sorted that out, it's then what information inputs do I need to create those outputs? And then what systems, business processes and quality systems do I need around that, the inputs and the reporting, to actually use the software well and give the right answer. When you've got the answer to all of those four questions, then you go, well, you'll actually start you've got a specification then for the software that you need, and it might be very simple or more complex and sophisticated. Then you can start looking at the marketplace and going, well, this one looks like it meets my requirements, or this one doesn't. And one of the things the last 20 years, I've done a lot of consulting on software around New Zealand and the Pacific, because that was sort of one of the things I was very good at back in 1996, and still to a certain extent. And we thought, and I want to say this, I've done slides on this before, software was the silver bullet when we started this asset management process in New Zealand in 1996. We will buy some software and we will do asset management. And a bit like the Lone Ranger, I had slides of the Lone Ranger with the silver bullet and stuff like that. And the thing is, there's no silver bullet. Software is just a tool to help you do the analysis and the collation of information that you need to present analysis and reports and understand what's happening with your network and stuff like that. And I think we all run the risk in this current information environment, this information revolution, that we can buy this vendor's product or we can develop a product ourselves and that will solve all our problems. And that is probably going to make you more problems than it solves if you go into it that way.
And also, what I found when I worked with utilities is that many times they start with buying the software first and then end up putting the asset management program in place that matches this piece of software. So this software needs this kind of information, so I go get that. Instead of the other way around, putting my program in place first and finding a software that best fits what I'm trying to do. So I don't know how many times I've come into utility and they tell me, I hate my software.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, and some of them are still paying for the software that they say they hate, and they're not using it. So the first thing is, okay, let's take a step back. What is it you wanted that software to do in the first place, and why do you hate it? Like, what is the component of that software that you don't like? Well, is it not answering the question you want? Is it taking too much time? Is it not the right user interface? What's wrong with what you have? Because sometimes the program is fine. It's just you haven't taken the time to think through what you wanted to do. And sometimes the program really doesn't fit your culture and your organization. But what's most important is to start first with the thinking. What do I want to do? What do I want to answer? What questions might my elected leaders be asking me to give them, and how will this tool help me answer those questions? And really thinking through what data you'd have to put in it, what expenses it would be going forward. Will a spreadsheet alone answer the question, or do you need something more robust? Do you need a maintenance work order system? What is it you're trying to accomplish, and how will that activity be enhanced by having a computer tool, so that you're thinking of a tool that fits what you want to do instead of you fitting a tool. So the software should not be the first thing you do. It should come down the line after you've thought through your program and what you want to accomplish.
Yeah. And software does not equal asset management. It's a tool. And look, if I think about the biggest thing that drives asset management engineers in New Zealand mad, or the bugbear that they have, it is, I want to run a report because I've got to produce something tomorrow. I know that information's in the system and I either can't get that report out, or there's a gatekeeper, or I've got to pay the vendor, $10,000 to produce this report. And I have to produce something for my boss or for the board tomorrow. I don't have 5 weeks to specify the report. And I just hear that time and time and time again. So whatever you do, you need to create something that provides your line asset management engineers or managers or your operations, same argument for the operations guys. Look, I know that information's in that system, I can't get it out. There's always the bugbear. And if you can get something that's got a reasonably flexible reporting tool that can just dump something out of the system to a spreadsheet or whatever, that's going to solve a lot of your angst, because that's what drives people nuts. They've got a job to do and they can't do it, and they've got to go cap in hand to get somebody who doesn't have the same priorities as they do. Now, that can be from a spreadsheet through to a sophisticated all singing, all dancing enterprise resource management database that's sitting on the cloud. If you can't get information out of it to report on the analysis that you need, your life is not going to be a happy life at that point.
And Dawn, I think there were some questions about software that I can't remember all the specifics that maybe we didn't address. So if there's any of those that we should have addressed, can you please send them back our way?
Absolutely. There were a couple of questions when you were mentioning being able to use a tablet or your phone with apps that are out there. So there were questions about, can you name some of those apps? Could you recommend a free GIS app? Are you familiar with certain types of apps? They named a few. So those are the types of questions they're looking for, some suggestions on maybe where to get started or even what to Google.
Yeah. So the short answer is we're not going to name any piece of software here today, so more than generic, because it's a contextualized question. You actually need to know what the situation of the utility is. And so for the people asking those questions, what I would suggest is contacting Heather and her team or EFC Network offline from the webinar and start getting an individual discussion going.
And there's sort of the same thing that we talked about with the asset management software. There's several different GIS companies out there. You know, some that are very, very expensive, all the way to the open source QGIS, which is just an open source thing that's out there that's, I believe, free. It's just people get on and geek out and figure out how it works. So there's pros and cons to using any one particular thing. You know, what's the expense to me to buy it versus what's the expense to me to learn how to use an open source software. So there's no hard and fast rule to say this is precisely what you ought to use, or you know, this is the answer for a particular utility. It kind of depends what resources you have access to. Is there somebody in your organization already who's doing mapping? We often find that if you're in a community municipality setting, the planning department or the zoning department or the tax department has mapping, GIS mapping, and you can tag along to their mapping, and they may have streets on there and houses, and you just are adding your pipes and, you know, other assets to their particular map, and you don't have to start from scratch. So sometimes just even seeking out, you know, what are you guys doing? You know, what else is happening in your community can help you get started with a, you know, particular approach.
One of the questions we got pre was like, are there recent technology innovations that can improve capacity of very small systems to effectively do AM? And I think one of the things, there's hundreds of these sorts of apps out there, but the ones that are form builder apps where they just allow you to build a really quick data form to put on a phone or a tablet, so you're not carting bits of paper around. A lot of those allow you just to grab a photo and a GPS reference where you are, and just those alone, I think, can just be fantastic for just getting simple lots of information. Yes, I was at this site, I inspected it this day, you know, and everything's good. And all of a sudden I've got that coming back. But again, you can either get a free one, there's hundreds of them around, you've got to invest the time into creating your own forms, or you can go to somebody who's working with utilities who's done all that for you and has a nice little interface. You'll pay some money for it. So again, there's no right answer, but that getting rid of double or triple or quadruple handling paper and having, you know, the whole error step of translating stuff from paper into a system is, I think, that's been a huge gain that people can use. Even like your pump station logs, you can use those sorts of systems for. So get rid of your logbooks and use a system like that, and just start building an information database.
And Heather, I'd like to mention that the EFC Network did a webinar last week on mapping and some tools available. And so if you missed that webinar, it will be available for viewing within the next week or so if it's not already posted. So there's a lot. That was a full hour discussion just on mapping. So there's a lot of information covered that we can't probably cover in this little bit of time.
And speaking of resources, just to show a couple of resources, because somebody did ask, or a couple of people asked about what's out there that you can look at to see what utilities are doing. I just want to mention a couple of resources. The American Water Works Association, AWWA, has a whole asset management committee. And if you want to get to be a part of that, you can check into that. They also have web pages and things. But one particular one I want to mention is this leading business practices in asset management report that does have case studies of several utilities. So you can find that on AWWA's webpage and get information there about some particular case studies. EPA has information on asset management resources, and it's very easy to find just searching EPA asset management. There's also this water finance clearinghouse that was set up for a slightly different purpose. It's in the Water Infrastructure Resilience and Finance Center, WRFIC. So the clearinghouse has a lot of resources, and you can sort through for reports and different things, and there's an asset management filter that you can put on, so you can get some information that way. The Southwest EFC site has a lot of different resources available for asset management, one of which I'm showing here is the Asset Management IQ that allows you to answer some basic questions about your utility, and you can track over time the improvements in your utility. And the last one, last but certainly not least, is Inframanage.com. It's a website that Ross War has developed quite a few years ago. It's got some great information, blog posts, all kinds of really good stuff. And I do some collaboration with Ross on this website. So that's a great place to go to find out what's going on in all kinds of areas of asset management. And I don't know, Ross, if you want to say a little bit more about Inframanage.
Just that we're continuing to update it and add more information all the time. So there's an awful lot of free resources there that people can dive in and find. And every time I come across an interesting report or whatever, I'll link it up onto there and do a blog post. So people be very welcome to have a look at that. APWA at the conference I was just at, they've just formed a standing asset management committee. So again, I would expect that there would be publications and information coming from them in the next few years as well. So it's an industry-wide approach that's happening. Lots of resources around.
And one last topic area I wanted to cover in the last few minutes that we have is we had several questions about asset management plans, what those are like, and kind of implementing your asset management program. So I did want to touch on the asset management report, and to be really, really cautious not to view the asset management plan or the asset management report as the end game, like the goal you're trying to get to. So you're going to not have a very successful program if you're viewing it as, I'm going to do all these things so I can get my report written and then I'm done. The report is merely a communication tool to kind of explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, think through the process, and it provides information to others about how you're doing it and why and that sort of thing. But it's just a blip along the way. It's not the end goal. It's not the end point. So be really cautious about viewing your plan that way, and only view it as it's sort of a way of summarizing what you're doing and how you're doing it, but your asset management program is going on the whole time. It goes on before you write the plan, after you write the plan, during the plan, and keeps going. And Ross, maybe you can talk a little bit about how New Zealand's experience of going from the 500-page plan to the much more brief plan that explains in greater detail what people are doing.
Yeah, and when we started, we put everything in them. We had all the history of the utility and all of those sorts of things, and it was really just a big data grab the first time through. And I think we're up to about the 7th iteration. And in the literature out of Australia and New Zealand, you will see a reference to a 3-year planning cycle. And it's really important to emphasise our political cycle in Australia and New Zealand is 3 years. We re-elect all our boards and our communities, municipalities and our federal governments on a 3-year cycle. We don't trust our politicians any much more to do more than 3 years. Here in America, it's a 4-year cycle. So if you're going to get into a cycle of updating, I would suggest 4 years. The UK is 5 years, and they have a 5-year cycle for their asset planning, because your politicians want to have input into the service levels and the strategic decision making. we have got some years back in 2006, our Auditor General, who his department audited all the asset plans, came back to the industry and said, look, you guys, this is a really great set of asset plans. You've got stunning technical detail and analysis, but nobody can actually understand what's important. And he came up with this phrase that you need to capture the right debate. And we're still trying to do that because it's a really good challenge. And the thing is, you can get buried in massive amounts of technical detail and analysis and, optimized decision-making analysis and forward planning and all those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, the community and the decision makers almost need a one-page or even a less that says, what are the really key issues that are going to knock us around? Where are the big dollars coming up? Where are our big risks? Those sorts of things. And they're not usually going to read 50 or 100 or 200 pages of technical detail to get the answer to that. So we've started putting that other information into technical reports and things like that, referencing those reports from the asset plans, but trying to distill it down to saying this is the big picture stuff, and then make your decision making off that. And what are the big decisions we need to make? What is the right debate that we need to have around how we're managing assets going forward?
All right, and one last thing we want to talk about, we only have a couple minutes left, is I love this question. How do you make the leap from creating the document to actually living the asset management dream? And I thought that was a fabulous question. And really that's what we've been talking about, is you don't want the document to be a piece of paper. You want the document to be, how am I going to change my behavior so that I'm actually making a difference? So as an example, we had a utility that had a long-term operator. The gentleman was retiring, and one of the issues was he had a lot of knowledge in his head about where assets are, and he was going to be going, so all that knowledge was going to go with him. So they wanted to develop a map and an inventory so a lot of that knowledge could get put into a format that others could use. So as the gentleman is developing this map, we became aware that they would often spend 2 to 4 hours looking for assets, and in one case up to 12 hours looking for an asset because they didn't know where they were. After they decide to do this plan and develop a map and an inventory, now it takes them less than 10 minutes to find all of their assets. So just living the dream is really about like putting into practice what it is you're trying to do. So if I want to know where my assets are, how do I put that into practice so that I can then spend a whole lot less time looking for my assets? And then you can ask yourself the question, well, the 2 hours I was searching for assets, maybe twice a week for 52 weeks, that's hundreds of hours a year that I now have bought myself that I can do something else. So maybe I can do maintenance, or I can do operational tasks, or I can do cleaning or inspections, or whatever it is that you wish you could do but never have time for.
Golf, perhaps.
Yeah. You now have that opportunity to do something else. So I think living the dream is really about just putting these simple things into practice, like applied common sense, as we often call asset management. It's just applied common sense. It's the kind of things you think, oh, I should have been doing it that way all along. Yeah, but you never really thought about it. You never had the time to think it through. So now you do. So just use your common sense and go from there. And I think we're kind of at the end of time, which with Ross and I, this kind of discussion goes by very quickly because we love to talk about asset management. But I think there's a few poll questions that we need to do at the end. So I guess I need to turn the screen back over. Is that correct?
No, that's not even necessary. We can even do them now. So these will be quick, I promise. We just want to make sure you get the opportunity to subscribe to our Environmental Finance Center blog if you would like. So for those attendees that do, you can hit yes. If you don't, no worries. And it looks like just about everybody is getting their response in. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. Thanks for voting. And then secondly, now is the time that you can tell us if you would like to receive in-depth technical assistance. If you happen to put in that you do, we will follow up with you. And if not, again, You can always change your mind, and if you want technical assistance at any point, you can go to our website and fill out our survey there. And then one last thing that I'd like to share with you is our evaluation form. We do look at these to see how we can improve our webinars. So if you want to fill this out for us, please do. You should get this in your chat box in just a second. And other than that, I think I'll hand it back over to Heather and Ross for their closing comments.
We want to thank everybody for sticking with us today. As I mentioned, you know, it's a favorite subject for both of us. We love to talk about asset management, and we encourage all of you to just jump in, start somewhere, start something. If you run into trouble, you can always reach out. We apologize for not getting through every single question that was provided to us, and we will have a future webinar. We like to do these things periodically, these Ask the Expert webinars periodically, so we'll schedule another one and we'll pick up with the questions we didn't cover this time. We'll pick up with those next time as a starting point for our next webinar.
And thank you for the questions. They've been really good questions, and the things we could talk about for a lot longer yet. I'd just like to encourage everybody that's listened, as Heather said, just to get on with asset management. Start simple, attack that cliched low-hanging fruit, do the simple good stuff quickly, and watch those gains start accumulating in your organization.
All right, well, thank you, everyone.